So we're going to continue on with our discussion of cellular respiration. So here is just sort of an overview of the entire process of cellular respiration. If you can kind of talk your way through this slide, you'll be in a very good place for our discussion. So starting off with is glycolysis. Glycolysis is going to be our very first step. It's going to occur out here in the cytoplasm. This is going to break glucose, which is a 6-carbon sugar, down into 2 3-carbon pyruvates. This ultimately occurs in the cytoplasm of almost every cell type. This process, or this step, is anaerobic, which means it does not require oxygen, but it's going to be responsible for producing NADH and 2 ATP molecules. So that's sort of what comes out of glycolysis. So this first stage takes place in the cytoplasm, and it produces NADH and 2 ATP molecules. If there is oxygen available, the pyruvate, which comes out of this step, is going to enter the prep reaction. The prep reaction is going to prepare the pyruvates for use in the citric acid cycle. If oxygen is not available, then fermentation will occur, and we won't even go through this process of cellular respiration. The citric acid cycle is also known as the Krebs cycle. It's just a cylindrical series of enzymatic reactions. This is going to occur in the matrix of the mitochondria. If you remember from earlier, the matrix is going to be that semi-fluid-like center of the mitochondria. This process is going to complete the breakdown of glucose by breaking its bonds between the carbons. So this is where we're going to be releasing a lot of carbon dioxide. Each pyruvate that enters the citric acid cycle as acetyl-CoA, it's going to produce NADH and 2 more ATP. So we have 2 more ATP being produced, and ultimately we're going to be releasing all of those broken carbons off in the form of carbon dioxide. Now the remaining hydrogen and electrons that are produced from this citric acid cycle are going to be carried away by NADH and another similar molecule called FADH2. Fats and proteins can be converted into compounds that can enter the citric acid cycle as well. So this is how we can use fats and proteins to supplement our energy when our carbohydrate supply is low. The last step is the electron transport chain. That's going to be over here. Here we're going to have the NADH from glycolysis and the citric acid cycle are going to deliver electrons to the electron transport chain. And the members of the electron transport chain will be carrier proteins embedded in the mitochondrial cristae. So this is where it becomes so important that we have a large surface area and to volume ratio. The citric acid cycle occurs in the matrix. Same with the prep reaction occurs in the matrix. But the electron transport chain is found on the cristae of the mitochondria. So it's important that we have a lot of exposure or lots of interaction between the between the matrix and the cristae. So each carrier located on the cristae is going to accept 2 electrons and then pass them on to the next carrier. And as these electrons relax down in energy, or they're transported from one carrier to the next, they're going to produce large amounts of ATP. Oxygen is going to be the final acceptor of the electrons at the end of the chain. So this is why we need oxygen for the electron transport chain. This is what makes the chain aerobic, meaning that it requires oxygen. After oxygen is released, after oxygen receives the electrons, it combines with hydrogens and it becomes water. And this is why we breathe in oxygen, so we can receive the electrons at the end of the electron transport chain. And we breathe out water vapor and carbon dioxide because we need to release those byproducts of cellular respiration. The energy that's released during cellular respiration, so this end electron transport chain can produce anywhere from 32 to 34 ATP. So the energy that's going to be released by cellular respiration is the end result is anywhere from 36 to 38 ATP. So hugely successful. Lots and lots of ATP are produced from the glycolysis of a single glucose molecule. So here's just sort of the written version of that, so that way you have those for your notes. But like I said, glycolysis. Glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm. It's going to be an anaerobic process, does not require oxygen, and it's going to be breaking down glucose to produce NADH and 2 ATP molecules. The prep reaction is the next step. If oxygen is available, we then move into the preparatory reaction, where we're just preparing the pyruvates for the citric acid cycle. If there is no oxygen available, then we'll move into fermentation, which we will talk about in a moment. The citric acid cycle is next. The citric acid cycle, like I said, is going to be a cyclical series of enzymatic reactions, and it's going to occur in the matrix of the mitochondria. This is where we're completely breaking down the glucose to release it, we'll be completely breaking down glucose and releasing those carbons in the form of carbon dioxide. We're ultimately going to be producing NADH and 2-ATP in this stage of the cycle. The remaining hydrogen electrons are going to be carried away by NADH and FADH2. The fats and proteins, like I said, could also be converted into compounds that can enter the citric acid cycle. So we can go through this process with molecules other than just glucose, although glucose is going to be our primary source of fuel. Here's a little review of the electron transport chain. Like I said, it occurs on the cristae of the mitochondria. NADH from glycolysis and the citric acid cycle are going to deliver the electrons to the electron transport chain. Those members of the electron transport chain will be carrier proteins embedded in the mitochondrial cristae. Each carrier accepts 2 electrons and then passes them on to the next carrier. Oxygen will be the final acceptor of those electrons at the end of the chain. Like I said, this process is aerobic. And so this is going to release energy that results in 32 ATP for a grand total of 36 to 38 ATP for the entire process of cellular respiration. In the event that we don't have oxygen readily available, the body will undergo a process instead called fermentation. Fermentation is anaerobic, meaning that it does not require oxygen. So if oxygen is not available, it won't be present to accept electrons, so the electron transport chain is functionally useless to us. So we're going to have to undergo a slightly different process. This process is known as fermentation. So glycolysis is the first step of fermentation, so that will still occur. However, instead of going into the rest of the mitochondria, we will finish out our process in the cytoplasm. Fermentation is only going to produce 2 ATP per glucose. If you remember back to the slide, the 2 ATP that come out of fermentation are coming as a direct result from this glycolysis. So in the case of fermentation, we're going to take 1 glucose molecule and we're only going to get 2 ATP from it, as opposed to cellular respiration, which could take that same glucose molecule and wring 36 to 38 ATP from it. So it's not a terribly efficient process. However, it is a very fast process, and it can occur in the absence of oxygen, which is a very important advantage for fermentation. The only bummer is that fermentation does produce toxic side products like lactate. Lactate can be very toxic to our own cells, especially in high quantities. This is why your muscles are sore after a workout, especially if it was an anaerobic workout. If you were not able to get enough oxygen to your muscles, they would have started to undergo fermentation, which can lead to the production of lactate, which can break down your muscles. So this is sort of where that soreness comes from, is from the overproduction of lactate or lactic acid. All right, so for this section, you should be able to summarize the roles of enzymes in chemical reactions, describe the basic steps required to break down glucose by cellular respiration, explain why the ATP cycle resembles that of a rechargeable battery. We didn't really go into that in great detail in this lecture. However, your textbook does review it and spends quite a bit of time going over that. So do spend a little bit of time with your ATP cycle. And then explain the differences between cellular respiration and fermentation. Would also like you to know the advantages and disadvantages to each. All right, and that's it for this section.